Hey guys, this is Kevin Kane with Precision Powerlifting Systems. I'm joined by Matt Bevy of PPS and Jay Birdie, of course. So I'm going to do a quick video on, I wrote an article about this the other day about having heuristics with technique. So I think I've had quite a few of these discussions with other coaches and lifters. I think we live in this era of powerlifting where it almost seems like everybody just kind of throws certain foundational technical aspects of the lifts out the window, and the argument is always, well, this is what works best for me. But when you look at the number of lifters that are in the world of powerlifting, most of them have only been lifting for a very short amount of time. They don't know what's going to give them the tallest ceiling at the end of their lifting careers. So I think it's really important that we have some type of heuristic that we're looking for in terms of technique. One, to make sure we're setting up the majority of the powerlifting community as beginners, making sure we're setting up beginners or intermediate lifters to be able to continually progress, stay healthy, and all of those things over the course of the entire time that they're participating in this sport. So when I had first started lifting, of course, I worked with Shaco, who said the technique is the most important aspect of training. And he had a very specific way of teaching the lifts, and I teach the lifts almost the exact same way that I had learned from him. And I even ran into this situation as a younger coach where it's like, oh, well, you look at how these people are lifting and it's like, this person's doing really well lifting like this, so maybe it doesn't matter, or maybe a rounded back deadlift is better than having a flat back because they can lift more this way. But if you're allowing beginner numbers to dictate your decision making, you're not setting them up for long-term success. I hate this saying, but that's basically what missing the forest for the trees is. You have these newer lifters, they're doing okay with these positions that you wouldn't necessarily say are optimal, and you're allowing them to continue to train in those positions because they do better. And as a coach, I understand we're collecting money from people, and if you're actually making their numbers go backwards at times, or you're maybe not voicing the expectations of training and long-term training well enough, that you kind of get nervous that if they don't do better, that you're going to lose your job or whatever. They'll fire you, move on to another coach, one that'll just let them do what they want. And it's happened to me quite a few times, and I don't give a fuck. Those lifters literally are doing the same things that they were before, and most of them aren't doing very well. So it is what it is, and you gotta remember that if you're planning to do this sport for a long time, you gotta lay that foundation. And what people miss with most sports is, I started playing soccer at 5 years old. I wasn't elite until I was 16, 17 years old. So there's a period of over 10 years that it required for me to go through that process of developing an elite skill set. The same can be said for powerlifting. If you look at the Russian strength system, their long-term athletic development plans, they started 8 to 10 years old. They go to these schools that kind of major in powerlifting. They get a lot of GPP work. They all do gymnastics. And there's this process of them building up to actually doing the competition lifts. So when everybody wanted to do what the Russians were doing, they're just taking the tip of the pyramid, and it's now becoming their base for the sport of powerlifting. So the high frequency, high volume, submaximal work, that was the tip of their pyramid. By the time they got to Shaco, when he was the national team coach, they had over 10 years of lifting experience. We're here in America, you get some 20-year-old who never played sports, maybe played high school sports. There's just not a lot of time under the barbell, and then they're being thrown into the tip of that pyramid, but that tip of the pyramid is now becoming their base. So they're not doing the things necessary to build up the abilities to handle certain amounts of work, the skill level within the lifts, the psychological composure that's required to lift big weights. And then what you end up getting is a sport that's, people follow other people on the internet, and you see people who start and they have very good success earlier on. So these people are lifting a ton of weight right in the beginning, so it's just their starting point is just higher than the average person's. But the majority of people lifting are still beginners, and that technical foundation and building up a solid base is extremely important for their long-term success. So when you look around at the IPF, the USAPL in particular, you don't have many people that last 5 years or more, or they have sustained success at the top. There's constant injuries. You see this really fast rise to the top, and then this really hard fall off in that 5-year period of time. And part of it's probably because those beginner gains finally stop, and then they don't know how to fix it. Or if they get hurt, you're using these high volume programs, so you're setting what you need as a bar, you're setting it so high in terms of workload that you end up getting hurt. And then when you get injured, now the number one biggest risk of injury is injuring yourself before. So now that same workload that you need to get better also comes with a higher risk of injury. So you start lower, you try to build up, build up, build up, injury risk increases, you run into the same thing, and it just becomes this, you're chasing the carrot on the stick at the end of the day. So like building that foundation, putting time underneath the bar, and building a foundation that is solid in general principles is extremely important. Another thing is when you look at lifters, so the argument I have a lot is the way I teach the squat. So we sit back in the squat. Shaco literally had me put my toes up against a wall to learn how to squat without my knees coming over my toes. And this wasn't for injury related stuff. This was because he found that using a technique like that had the biggest squats. And the Russians and the Ukrainians had the biggest squats in the world. And I know when you look around at the IPF, you're like, oh, well, America wins all the Raw World Championships. That's because people like Yuri Belkin compete as amateurs in the IPF. Then they move on very quickly to money meets. They take drugs. They lift way more weights. The United States doesn't do as well in the equipped IPF part of it. The American men don't ever win. I think the highest that they ever finished was 4th. So other countries are still better than America with their amateur athletes, and we put all of our eggs into one basket with the raw lifting stuff. So I think it's a complete misnomer to look at the United States' success in an amateur lifting competition against other amateurs when their top lifters aren't lifting in that federation. So these are all things that I think we need to keep in mind. Now you'll look at some of these lifters in the USAPL that do very well at the top, but they don't lift with the technique that I would necessarily say is optimal for the general population that's getting into powerlifting. And also, if you're going to be very vertical and you're going to wear lifting shoes and your knees are going to drive forward, yeah, you're going to build very strong quads. But what about that lower back? And the number one most injured part of a person when they're lifting tends to be the lower back. So you might want to stress that a little bit, and you might want to train those angles and really build up that lower back. For one, it's going to help decrease injury risk, because at the end of the day, whoever can train longer and stay healthier is probably going to win. So even though somebody may outlift me now 5 years in, if I'm healthier 5 to 10 years from now, I'm going to be crushing them on the platform because they weren't able to do these things. And also, like, variability we know is extremely important in every single sport to develop a large skill set. When you look at from beginners to elite level athletes, there's this inverse U that happens in terms of variability. So elite and beginners both have a very high level of variability within their movements. Beginners are just trying to figure it out. Elite athletes know how to adapt to the environment to utilize it to the best of their capability. So they're improving a specific skill set. So if you're just doing the same positions all of the time and you're not working on weak areas, at some point you're going to have, maybe you squat 600 pounds, you're going to, and this is kind of like quoting what Louis Simmons would say, but you're going to have 600-pound legs and a 400-pound lower back. And at some point, and like to use his quote, weak things break. At some point, that lower back is going to be, one, it's going to be what stops you from lifting more weight. Two, it's going to be what ends up getting you hurt. So making sure that we're training strong angles, we're training all angles, all of that stuff is important. So even though I teach the lifts in one specific way, we do move around and we vary them a lot. But, and we're going to get into why I do this, one of the biggest reasons is it helps me make decisions. So if I just let anybody squat however they're most comfortable squatting, how can you pick a variation or identify strengths and weaknesses that allows you to construct a program that helps to make them better? At that point, it just becomes you're just looking at volumes and intensities on a piece of paper as opposed to that person as a whole. Also, I want to see improvement. So if we're looking for improvements in technique, you need to have some boxes to check to see if what you're trying to get them to do works. Now, I don't sit there and I will cue my lifters, but I don't over cue them. I want to see these things naturally just progress over time. So if we have a lifter with a very forward knee travel in that squat, that's fine if that's how they lift the most weight. They're going to get a lot of box squats and other things that force them to sit back. And when I remove the box and those other pieces, I want to see them improve those angles. I want to see the shins be a little bit more vertical. I want to see them use the hips, hamstrings, and low back more than the quads. Like, it just tends, if you're not built to be a very quad heavy squatter, it's going to be very hard to stay upright in that squat without a strong posterior chain. So when I teach the squat, We do change our foot angle all over the place, but your feet are going to be probably outside of your shoulders somewhere. Your toes are going to be angled 30 to 45 degrees, give or take, depending on the person. And if somebody prefers to be a little bit tighter, they're going to turn their toes out a little bit more so we get that same shin angle that I'm looking for, so that the adductors, the hips, the hamstrings are all getting hit the exact same way. From there, like if somebody prefers more forward knee travel, their feet will just be closer. Because the closer your feet are, the more your knee is going to travel forward anyways. But at some point, you just don't have a lot of really close stance squatters squatting, breaking world records. Like they end up having to come out wide. And the ones who are tight, most of them don't even hit depth. And I get it, some of them get white lights at competitions, but we all have eyes. So where we put our feet is just going to determine the amount of forward shin angle that they get. I want to see a good arch in the lower back. So when we're out there, our ribs should be slightly flared. Our chest should be tall and in that proud position. We fill up our belt and we push into the belt. Not having an arch in your lower back, so the argument tends to be like that whole neutral spine thing. So when we have a barbell on our back, right? So the barbell has a center of gravity, the person has a center of gravity. That athlete barbell complex, the center of gravities need to line up in order for a nice smooth bar path and for you to put optimal force or the most force you can into that bar in one position. So if I try to keep a neutral spine and I try to sit back in the squat because I want to use my hips and my hamstrings, it's going to be very hard to do because I need to lean forward, right? So as I lean forward, if the bar is on top of my rear delts, I'm going to be in front of, right? The bar is going to be in front of my center of gravity. That's how you pitch forward, you end up falling forward, whatever, right? But if I'm in this same position and all I do is arch my back and put my head up, look at where it puts that barbell. It puts it over the center of my foot. So people's argument is, oh, if you sit back more, you're going to have to lean forward more. That's not necessarily true. And when I arch my back, it gives my hips more leverage because it brings it closer to the bar. So now that the bar is over the center of my foot, my hips are underneath, I have a good arch in my back. So that bar is on your back. You probably want to keep your back extended to be able to support that load to begin with so that it doesn't push you around. So then when you hit the hole, right, if I'm coming back and I'm here and I'm trying to keep a neutral spine and I come up, look at where that weight is. It's in front, it's pushing me down. So it's going to be very hard to rise as one unit. But if I open my knees and I'm here, my hips are closer to the bar, I can use more legs, I have just greater leverage, and my back muscles are more taut, so they're able to support that weight and push back into that bar to keep that bar over the center of my foot and let my hips and my legs do the rest of the work. So that's how I like to teach the squat. So I want to make sure we're in a position where the knees don't travel too far forward. So if I put my feet straight and I try to squat down like this, I have to have that same lean, and I get stuck in this position where it's going to be very hard to hit depth. I can't open my knees to let my hips sink down if I need to drop it a little bit deeper. I can't, even if I'm here and I try to arch my back, I can't. I'm literally stuck in this position here, and that bar is going to be in front of my center of gravity. And a lot of people like to squat that way, but if you take a beginner and you put them underneath a bar when they have very low skill sets within the lifts, that's what they try to do. It just feels more stable to them. It doesn't mean that that's how anybody should be squatting. And in fact, I don't think anybody should be squatting that way. But from those positions, all you can use, your hips don't have leverage, your back doesn't have a lot of leverage. All you basically have is your quad strength. And for a lot of people, yes, their quads are stronger and it allows them to lift more weight at that period of time. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it is the right way to do it. I think when you think of it logically, if I can use my back, my hips, my hamstrings, and my adductors, I'm going to lift a hell of a lot more than if I just use my quads. And your ability to stay upright, because you're loading your hips and your hamstrings. It's like a deadlift. When we talk about taking the slack out of the bar, you're loading that gravity into your body before you pull. If you do that on the way down with a squat, you're loading your hips and your hamstrings and everything else, you're not going to pitch forward. It's going to help you stay in a better position because you and the barbell have become one. That athlete barbell complex, your center of gravity is aligning up. The bar is just basically a connection and extension of your body at that point. But if the bar is moving around and it's getting in front of your center of gravity, or you're trying to force things by like trying to hit depth and do all of these other things, it's going to be a problem. So in order to keep our back muscles taut, we need to keep our head up. So you have a lot of people who tend to like look down in the squat. But the thing is, if my head comes forward, one, it does two things. You can see if I'm just standing upright and I start to bring my head forward, it's going to pull my body weight forward onto my toes. So now my center of gravity is going to shift in front of the middle of my foot. And also, if my head's coming forward like this, or it's looking down, it's rounding my upper back. So it's decreasing the leverage that your upper back muscles actually has to support the weight. So what you end up doing, you look down and you're just creating a tabletop instead of really like squeezing your back, resting the bar on top of your rear delts, and pulling the bar down. So there's a point of getting tight and using that tension to control the barbell, and there's a point of just bending over and just allowing the barbell to sit on your back. One of the other pieces is you see a lot of people, they're told to get their hands as tight as possible, to be as tight as possible. This just squishes stuff together. It's the same as on a deadlift when you see people setting up and they're getting tight at the top before they come down. That's not doing anything. The point of creating tension is absorbing the load that you're about to lift into your body to kind of make that load in your body one unit. So if you're not doing that, if you're just trying to get tight before you do something or just squishing things together, that's not tension. Like if you grabbed a lat pull down, where you have the most leverage to pull down, that's probably where your grip is going to be on a squat. When you come inside, you just don't get that same leverage in your back muscles. They're just squished together. And it's this like fake tension. And so, we want our hands out a little bit. Your elbows should be in line with your torso, slightly behind it. So when I'm at the bottom of a squat, if I'm holding that bar, when I'm at the bottom of a squat, I want to see my elbows in line with my torso. If I'm in tight, they're gonna come back. It's gonna round my upper back. And the first thing that has to happen is that upper back, those traps, need to push into the bar to keep it over the center of your foot before you start standing up. But if I'm round, I have no leverage to do that. You're gonna pitch forward every single time, especially when the weight gets heavier. It's harder for those upper back muscles to support the weight the heavier that it gets. So we need to make sure our hands are set up in a position that allows us to create tension in our upper back, that allows us to pull the bar down, to bring it into our back muscles, that our back muscles stay extended the whole time. That's really important. And this, when we do this, it's just this fake, false security of being tight. We wear flats because, like I said before, if you're gonna sit back into your squat, you need to wear flats. You can't sit back in heels. So when you get these fucking dweebs squatting with their feet out wide, wearing giant heels, that defeats the fucking purpose. Like if you're gonna wear heels, you should be in a lot more tighter than that. And if you're out wide, it literally shifts your center of gravity back. So why would you want a raised heel that actually pushes you forward? It makes no sense. This is why you see knees cave in and depth becomes a major problem with those positions. In terms of taking our breath and everything else too, nothing should move. Okay, so like it should just be a small breath of air into the stomach, push out into the belt, and we're just pulling down. You see, people step back and the bar is bouncing up and down. Nothing should move. And there was actually a Russian study that Shaco had told me about where they showed that when the lungs are half filled and your breath is held for a short period of time, you actually have the most power. So you're just trying to create intra-abdominal pressure. So it's not this huge breath, it's just a small breath into your belly, push out into your belt just to increase that pressure. Helps with that thoracic stiffness so that the bar doesn't push you around. You can keep your knees out, use your hips, all of that stuff. But even as you take your breath, you don't push your ribs down, you just push out into the bar. So it just like supports that arched position. With the, I'm saying bye to Bevy and Jess because they're done with this conversation. So in terms of the bench press, I've changed the way that I do this a little bit. So I used to have everybody get their hands as wide as possible. So grip is going to vary depending on the person, depending on their strengths and their leverages and everything else. But we make sure that we're in a position where our legs don't move, right? So in a lot of cases, they're wider. They're not tucked super far back. I think a lot of times, and I had taught this before, that you're trying to get a bigger arch, but you just end up arching through the lower back, which doesn't even increase where your touch point is. So if you're not decreasing the range of motion of the lift, why do something that just makes your back cramp up and stuff like that? But one of the biggest differences that I think when I teach the bench press that I want to see is I want to see a straight bar path. So I know Louis Simmons had talked about a straight bar path, but when I was coached by Jeremy Hartman, he really emphasized that point to me. And he made a lot of good points about the lifters who end up flaring hard, they tended to be the ones with me that had the most like shoulder and pec things that would go on that we'd always have to take a step back. So we're never really able to do a ton of volume. So maybe, you know, in the biomechanical argument of when you do that, it gives the pecs greater leverage to lift the weight. That's true. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing in that one-off setting. But if we constantly had to take time stepping back for training and everything else, it's not worth it. I'd rather be able to learn how to press in a straight line, strengthen the triceps so we can train harder and not get hurt as much. So even if we take a little bit of a loss on the weight on the bar, but we can gain more in terms of quality training sessions, over the long run, the more quality training sessions is going to yield to greater outcomes. And plus that shorter range of motion, if you get speed off that chest, it's just, as long as you're not getting that horizontal displacement of the bar, that speed's going to carry through that sticking point a lot better. And since we started instituting these principles, we started benching a lot better. Now, not everybody's going to have a straight bar path, but they try to keep it as straight as possible. That's just the goal. So we don't have these hard flaring elbows, we don't have these pec issues, and the stronger your arms are, the more speed you're going to get off of the chest. And then a lot of it comes down to technique. So keeping the upper back squeezed together, the legs driving all your weight onto your neck and shoulders, and thinking about pushing your back into the bench as you bench, or pushing your body away from the bar as opposed to just trying to push the bar away from your body and losing that upper back. So, you know, I think the bench press can be very complicated for some. You know, and this is probably pretty common to how most people do bench press, but we just don't tuck back and try to arch our lower backs as hard as humanly possible. It's more about making sure everything's tight and in position so that we can get that better bar path. And whenever we see deviations from that bar path, we can see that something needs to be tighter and we can start to fix that. But having that heuristic, so if I want a straight bar path, that means we need to have really strong triceps. As they start to improve that strength, I can start to see the changes being made into that bar path, and it lets me know that what we're doing is working. And then over time, you see the numbers increase. You know, same with the squat. They like really knees forward squats, but over time, like I was saying before, we move the blocks away, we put them back into those positions. You start seeing the feet creep out a little bit more. The shins tend to be more vertical, and you just see better solid positions in the hole and on that change of direction. That's really important to me. Now, we train all grips. We have close grip, medium grip, wide grip. We do the same for stances on the squat. We change bar placement from low bar to high bar. Oh, and the other thing with the squats too, I don't really like people holding the bar super low on their back. So rear delts, top of the rear delts is where a low bar squat goes. This gives us, it decreases the moment arm for the thoracic extensor, so it makes it a little easier on our back muscles without increasing the mobility requirements. So if you hold it down too much, it's really hard to get that good arch in that upper back. So we want to make sure it's in a position that allows us to be in the best positions to complete the lift. Top of the rear delts, it's what Shaco taught, it's what I teach, and it's for that reason. It just allows us to control our positions a little bit better, which then allow us to control the weight better, and then we learn how to produce more force. We can lift more weight. Same on the bench press, straight bar path, everything's tight. You know, we'll get the feet, everything set up, so we're not trying to increase an arch, but giving up some leg drive that makes us lose our upper back, or we don't have as much leverage to push into the bench. Like, making sure that we're in good positions so that we can lift the weight. Now, I teach the deadlift in a very similar manner that I teach the squat. So the arch in the lower back, pushing out on the feet, all of those things. One thing with the squat and the deadlift, if people push straight down into the ground, that's when you'll see the knees cave in. And if they push with their feet before they use their upper body, you'll see the pitching come forward. So typically you'll have people try to stand straight up through their feet before they even drive the chest up. So you see the knees cave in, chest fall forward. So one, it's like learning, and I've done videos on this, learning how to load the weight into your body pre-lift so that you're nice and tight and everything can move. But you're pushing out on your feet, which actually decreases the length of your femur in terms of like the forces being applied. So you're pushing out on your feet, arching your back, and when you grab that bar and you pull up, you're pulling up with your traps and your back before you're pushing out with your feet, so that everything comes up as one solid unit. This is even true of a conventional deadlift. You're just not gonna, it just feels a little bit different. Even though your feet are together, your toes are gonna be turned out just a little bit, and you're still pushing your knees into your elbows, spreading the floor, whatever cue people are using for this. lifting with your torso and then driving with the legs and trying to push the hips through. One of the things that you see a lot on the deadlift is, especially, sumo, conventional, doesn't matter. They come down and you see they start a little rounded, it comes up, and then here it's like this. And it just becomes this re-extension of the erectors at the top. So rounding our back at the bottom decreases the moment arm of our spinal erectors, gives them a little bit more leverage. But when our ass tucks under like that, it removes the leverage of our hips and hamstrings to actually do their job. So it becomes, upper back and quads basically, because as your ass tucks under, your weight's going to shift forward and your knees will shift forward. So typically what you see is if people, they have the shins touching the barbell and they round like that off the start, you'll see the bar get pushed away because the shins are actually getting driven forward. So the quads are actually, you're throwing the weight under the quads to try to lift the weight. But then to re-extend at the top, it becomes very difficult. And what we see there is we're not using hips at the bottom. And when we don't use hips at the bottom, they really have no leverage at any point of the lift to do anything. So then, if we're above the knees and we have a good arch and we can drive our hips forward, but if we're round and we're above the knees, it just ends up to be this re-extension of the torso. So at no point do we really use the hips. So if we start targeting different positions, so like below the knees, really puts the hips in a tough leverage position. We work on keeping that arch, driving off the blocks that way. A parallel box squat, same thing, puts the hips in a tough spot, but you're sitting back into your arch. And if you don't lead with the traps off the box, you'll pitch forward very fast. So it teaches you to kind of put all those mechanics together. And the box squat helps the deadlifts quite a bit. So learning how to put all of those together under heavier weights also requires that psychological component, because the second somebody freaks out a little bit or everything starts speeding up in their mind a little bit, they're going to rush through things, they're going to be in bad positions, and they're just going to go back to doing what they were doing before. And the only way you can fix those psychological components is to give them the tools to actually handle those psychological components. So max effort lifts challenge the technique under heavier loads, can challenge weak areas under heavier loads, making it very sport specific, and also has a psychological component to it that makes it very sport specific, competition specific. If we're just trying to work on those positions with nothing more than submaximal weights and we just disregard those psychological pieces, we can run into some serious problems because it won't fix itself if they're still nervous and those nerves are dictating their behaviors when the weights get heavy. So having those max effort lifts is important for the psychological components of the lifting itself. So for me, it's really important to have these guidelines to tell the lifters this is what I want to see. So even with something like, I want to put my head down, I'm not a big fan of letting somebody do that. Put it up, do the lifts like how I'm teaching you to do the lifts, because all of my programs are guided to make you strong in those positions. And also, as a coach, I want to see those positions get stronger. And it's putting you in the best position to be successful. Now, everybody will be like, what about individual differences? And you're right, there are individual differences. So for the squat, where people place their hands is an individual difference. Where people place their feet is going to be an individual difference. And these things could change as the person changes over time. As they build more muscle mass, they might have to bring their hands out a little bit. As the hips and stuff get stronger, you might see their feet come out a little bit more. The toe flail angle changes from person to person based off of strengths, weaknesses, comfort, and how their hips are built. There's definitely individual variations there. Where people choose a grip on a bench press, how much they arch, where they put their feet to get set up on a bench press. All of those things are individual differences based off of strength and weaknesses and their actual biomechanical makeup. Whether somebody chooses to pull conventional or sumo, a medium stance sumo versus a wide stance sumo, all of those things are going to be individualized based off of the person. And obviously their start positions and stuff like that, and the torso angles and those things change slightly based off of people's builds, and it does kind of shift where the strengths and the weaknesses are going to lie under those circumstances. So that's something that the coach needs to understand as well. Now, we train all of those angles no matter what, because I feel it's important that every lifter explores all those available options. But we train those angles under those technical heuristics that I've developed, that I've taken from Shaco. I've updated a little bit with the stuff that I've learned and stuff I've learned from other coaches, but that still guides the process. But we get a lot of variability within that. So if you're doing a high bar close stance squat, even though I'm teaching you how to do it a specific way, I'm teaching you a powerlifting squat in a specific way, your torso angle is going to be more vertical. Your knees are going to come more forward. We still train those positions. So it's not like we disregard those positions because we should be strong at all angles. However, and the quads still play a major role. Our knees are bent. You know, even if your shins are vertical at the bottom of the squat, the quads are still playing a pretty important role in the squat. It just gives the hips better leverage and they kind of take over a little bit more. So we're training all angles, but I want to see those angles improve and I want to see those technical heuristics that I put out. I truly believe it sets people up for the best long-term success. And you can look at all these top lifters that are out there and be like, hey, well, this person squats like that. A lot of them are just genetically gifted at the sport. You know, an example I like to use a lot for this is Pedro Martinez didn't necessarily throw a baseball like how you would teach anybody to throw a baseball. He whipped his torso across, tended to be something that people would chalk up to he will have arm problems because of the way that he pitches. He never did. It worked for him. But there's only one Pedro Martinez. He's a n=1 scenario. I mean, he was a freak of nature in the sport. That doesn't mean you would allow a younger kid who's newer in the sport to just pitch like Pedro Martinez pitches. Like, you're going to teach him certain fundamental techniques that he needs to master first. And maybe as he gets older and he starts messing around with stuff, he realizes that he can throw harder that way. But there may be a cost associated with it. We've seen a lot of pitchers that ended up having all kinds of elbow issues and arm issues because of, though they blame it on those mechanics, but it could be workload issues and other aspects, but it's something you have to keep in the back of your mind. So the majority of people that are in powerlifting, raw powerlifting has only been around for like 7 years, 8 years. It's not that old. So you just don't have a lot of people who've been doing it a long time. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind, that with these people that are doing it for a short period of time, they need to learn the fundamentals of the sport, really execute those fundamentals well, and then they can move on from there. Make sure you follow along on my Instagram page. It's KW Cannon, our team, Precision Powerlifting Systems.